Welcome, preaching students of the Expositors Academy, to this explainer. Look, if you've ever felt like the Old Testament is just this giant, confusing puzzle of disconnected stories, poetry, and prophecy, you're definitely not alone. But today, we're going to put those pieces together. We're unpacking a really fascinating lecture by Expository on the overarching meta-narrative of the Old Testament. We'll see how every single book, when we use a consistent literal hermeneutic, actually contributes to one massive, epic story, the rise, the fall, and the future hope of God's earthly kingdom.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the kingdom meta-narrative, the Old Testament narratives, poetical and wisdom literature, the prophets, and finally, wrap up with the implications for you as expositors. Let's get right to it.
All right, before we actually dig into the text, we've got to define our theological lens. Espiritu calls this the mediatorial kingdom. Now, what does that mean? It's not just some spiritual rule hidden away in people's hearts. No, the source material makes it clear. This is God's earthly physical rule, and it's exercised through delegated human vice-regents. Think about it. God is the supreme ruler, but he physically molds mankind from the clay to act as his image-bearers right here on earth. You'll want to keep this definition in the back of your mind, because it's literally the engine driving the entire Old Testament.
Section 1. Old Testament Narratives. The rise and shattering of the kingdom.
Now, these narratives do the absolute heavy lifting of our kingdom story. The physical kingdom is established perfectly in Eden, fractured completely by the fall, and then patiently shaped over centuries through the patriarchs and the Exodus. It hits this glorious high point during the Davidic kingdom, only to be, tragically, shattered into pieces during the exile.
Let's zoom in on Genesis for a second. When you preach Genesis, it's absolutely crucial to present Eden as a microcosm of the world. Adam was put in that garden to cultivate it, right? But the source notes this was essentially practice. It was a dry run for his real macro mission, to multiply, fill, and subdue the whole earth. God was actively shaping this earthly domain, but Adam's revolt, his grab for autonomy, threw a massive wrench in that program. Man was exiled. But, and here's the grace of God, he immediately promised a new Redeemer, another Adam, someone who would crush the serpent and get this kingdom back on track.
And the way God continues this program is just brilliant. As you prep your sermons, keep your eyes peeled for these microcosm zoom-ins. Here's a mind-blowing one. When Moses' mother saves him by floating him down the Nile, the author uses a super rare Hebrew word for that basket. The word is teba. You know where else that exact same word is used? Noah's Ark. No way, right? Both the ark and the basket were divine instruments to preserve a deliverer. They gave mankind a fresh start, molding a new humanity meant to lead the nations back to God.
From Moses, the kingdom really starts to take a definite shape. First, at the Sinai covenant, Israel is freed specifically to be God's kingdom on earth. Then, God establishes David's throne with an eternal, unbreakable promise. By the time we hit Solomon, the physical kingdom reaches its absolute peak, giving the surrounding nations a sneak peek of the abundance of God's completed program. But then comes the tragic part. Solomon's idolatry sparks a severe downward slide. The kingdom fractures, and eventually, God brings in the Assyrian and Babylonian empires to judge his people.
And that brings us to the exile. With Jerusalem destroyed, God's earthly kingdom essentially vanishes. It's crushed like dried clay. But even in the darkest moments, God is so remarkably faithful. Through exilic narratives like Daniel and Esther, we see him actively preserving his scattered people, even deep inside the godless courts of Babylon and Persia. He hasn't abandoned the kingdom project at all. It's just temporarily on hold.
Section 2. Old Testament Poetical and Wisdom Literature. Life in a Fractured Kingdom.
When you're opening up your Bible to exposit these books, remember this key context. They are exploring the inner life of citizens living in a deeply cursed world, desperately waiting for their Redeemer. Every single book offers a totally unique angle. Job? He models absolute loyalty to the divine king when creation is suffering and perverted. The Psalms show us the inner worship of God's citizens, all while pointing relentlessly to a future messianic priest-king who's going to rule the earth. Proverbs gives us the boots-on-the-ground wisdom for living under God's lordship right now. And Ecclesiastes, it urges us to fear God amidst all the chaos and futility of a world where the Redeemer hasn't set things right quite yet.
Then you have the Song of Songs. And you might be sitting there wondering, okay, what does poetry about romance have to do with the global kingdom? Well, it actually links right back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Espiritu points out that Song of Songs reflects God's beautifully original design for marriage. It's a great reminder that marriage is not just about romance. It's a strategic, divinely bestowed instrument to multiply and fulfill mankind's very first mandate to rule over the earth.
Section 3. Old Testament Prophets. The promise of restoration.
Now, we know the prophets have a lot to say about judgment, sure, but their ultimate, final focus is always restoration. Just look at Isaiah. His promises are totally foundational. He focuses super heavily on the Messiah, revealing that he's going to be a suffering servant who atones for sin, absolutely, but also a Davidic king who will rule a literal earthly kingdom. Isaiah envisions this glorious future where even nature itself is transformed, where predators and prey are safely hanging out together. It's all pointing straight to the new heavens and new earth.
And Isaiah 65 drops this fascinating detail that really ought to shape your eschatology. It says, "The young man shall die 100 years old." Now, Esposito argues this proves the Messianic kingdom is a completely distinct phase from the final eternal state. Why? Well, think about it. In this kingdom, human lifespans expand massively, but people do still die. Sin is suppressed, but it's not totally gone. The curse of the fall is pushed way back, but it hasn't been fully eliminated yet.
So, the obvious question is, how will this fractured, rebellious nation ever be ready for a kingdom like that? Well, listen to this incredible promise from Jeremiah 31. This is the absolute linchpin for Israel's future restoration, the infallible new covenant. God guarantees that he is going to reshape and transform the hearts of his people, literally writing his law right inside them. A physical kingdom requires a spiritually transformed citizenship, and God promises he's going to provide exactly that.
Ezekiel gives us a really similar picture of this internal remolding. God promises to give Israel a new heart and to cause his spirit to actually indwell them. This is what will finally reunite the fractured nation under a permanent covenant of peace. And miraculously, God's glory, which, remember, had tragically departed in judgment, will actually return to a brand new temple in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Daniel gives us the historical framework for exactly how we get there. He outlines these massive, successive worldly empires: Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. But look at the climax of history here. Every single one of these human kingdoms will ultimately be crushed by the Son of Man, and he's going to establish a physical, completely indestructible, everlasting dominion right here on earth.
Finally, Zechariah adds some incredible, vivid detail to this event. He predicts the Lord entering Jerusalem on a donkey, but also returning later to the Mount of Olives. And when he does, Zechariah says it will cause immense, radical geographical changes to the actual landscape. The Lord will deliver this city, he'll usher in his global kingdom, and he'll make even the most mundane, everyday objects in Jerusalem holy.
Section 4. Implications for expositors. Let's talk about applying this lens.
So let's bring it all home. What does this meta-narrative mean for you as future expositors, as you study and preach the Old Testament? How does this completely change your approach? Well, we want to leave you with Quito Espiritu's ultimate challenge. Is the overarching narrative of the Old Testament just about a spiritual salvation, or is it about the establishment of God's physical kingdom? Honestly, how you answer that one question is going to completely dictate your exegesis. It'll determine whether you spiritualize the prophetic texts or read them literally. And most importantly, it's going to define exactly what you expect God's next move in global history to be. Keep that question right in front of you every single time you open the text. Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer. Keep studying hard, and we'll see you next time.